Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping straight into, well, a really fascinating world where psychology and economics kind of crash into each other. Behavioral economics.
That's right. We're going to explore how we actually make decisions as, human beings.
And spoiler alert,
Yeah.
it's often not the perfectly rational process you might think it is.
Yeah.
Our goal today, pretty simple. Pull out some genuinely useful insights.
Yeah, things you can actually apply to your own life, maybe starting, but like right now.
Exactly. And our main guide for this exploration is the brilliant work of Richard Thaler.
Specifically, his book, Misbehaving, The Making of Behavioral Economics. It's great because it's not just dry theory.
No, not at all. It's like a behind-the-scenes look at how the whole field developed, basically by noticing all the weird things people actually do.
It's packed with those moments where you just nod and go, oh yeah, I've totally done that.
Totally. So we're going to try and skip the really heavy academic jargon and just dive into the core ideas.
And illustrate them with everyday examples, things that will probably feel, pretty familiar.
We're really focusing on what all this means for the choices you make day in, day out. Okay, let's get into it.
Right. So Thaler kicks things off by highlighting this really crucial distinction. It's between what he calls econs and humans.
Econs, like economic robots?
Kind of, yeah. In classical economic theory, the standard model basically assumes we all act like econs. These are perfectly rational beings.
The kind who always make choices to maximize their own self-interest, weigh every option perfectly.
With cold, hard logic, never get tripped up by emotions.
Yeah.
Their decisions always line up just right. Completely logical.
Yeah, these mythical creatures. But Thaler's journey, it really started by noticing something pretty obvious. Real people. Humans. We often act very differently.
He actually started keeping a list, didn't he, of these kind of head-scratching behaviors.
He did. The list.
And what's so interesting is that these weren't just like random mistakes, they were systematic patterns, ways our behavior consistently deviated from that econ model.
Like the example of Jeffrey and the basketball tickets.
Oh yeah, classic. Drove through a terrible blizzard to get to a game just because he'd already paid for the ticket.
Right. Whereas an econ, a purely rational being, would say, okay, the money's gone. Irrelevant now. Is driving in this blizzard worth the fun of the game right now?
Exactly. That's the rational calculation. But Jeffrey, being human, was totally swayed by that sunk cost, the money he'd already spent.
It feels like waste, doesn't it? Even if it's illogical.
It really does. Or take Stanley and his wine. He owned a bottle he bought years ago for maybe $10.
Okay.
But he wouldn't even think about selling it for less than, say, $100. And yet, he wouldn't buy another bottle of the same wine at $100 either.
Huh. So for an econ, the price they'd buy it and sell at should be pretty close, right? Based on the market value.
Pretty much, yeah. Stanley's massive difference there. That's pure human attachment. It's his wine now.
That makes sense. And then there's Linnea and saving $10.
Right. She was happy to drive across town, spend 10 minutes to save $10 on a $45 clock radio.
Okay. Seems reasonable.
But she wouldn't bother doing the same thing to save $10 on a, $495 television.
But it's still $10 saved. An econ would value their time the same way, wouldn't they?
Precisely. The absolute saving is identical, so the effort should be weighed equally against that saving. But for Linnea, the context mattered. The percentage saving felt different.
It's those everyday inconsistencies, isn't it? They really show the gap between the tidy model and, well, messy reality.
Totally. Like Lee feeling okay about his wife buying an expensive sweater, but he'd feel guilty buying it himself.
Even though it's the same household money.
Exactly. The financial impact is identical. Or think about the host taking away the cashew bowl at a party.
Because everyone's just mindlessly eating them before dinner.
Right. But econs always prefer more choices. Taking an option away shouldn't make an econ happier, but it makes the humans at the party better off because it helps their self-control.
Yeah.
Thaler saw these patterns again and again, and his central point, his sort of call to arms for economics, was this key statement.
Okay, what was it?
It is time to stop making excuses. We need an enriched approach to doing economic research, one that acknowledges the existence and relevance of humans.
Stop pretending we're econs, basically.
Pretty much. We need theories that actually account for, well, us.
So what's the big takeaway here for someone listening? I guess just recognizing that we are wired to be human with all our quirks and inconsistencies. That's useful in itself.
Definitely. It helps explain why you might cling to those concert tickets even when you're feeling sick, or why you get weirdly attached to that old sofa.
It's about understanding your own seemingly illogical choices And maybe being a bit more forgiving of others' baffling decisions, too.
Exactly. And building on that basic idea that we're humans, not econs, Thaler, digs into some specific psychological principles that really drive our choices.
Okay.
One of the absolute giants is prospect theory. This was developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who Thaler worked closely with.
Right. Nobel Prize winners.
Indeed. And prospect theory offered a totally different way of looking at how people really make choices, especially when there's risk involved. Uncertainty. It moved away from the older expected utility theory.
And a key piece of that is how we judge things.
Yeah.
Right. Not just the final outcome, but
Gains and losses relative to a starting point, our reference point. Usually that's just our current situation, the status quo.
and the big insight is about losses versus gains.
Huge insight. The psychological sting of a loss is way more powerful than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Okay, how much more powerful?
Well, Thaler puts it bluntly in the book. He says, roughly speaking, losses hurt about twice as much as gains make you feel good.
Wow. Twice as much. That's
Yeah.
significant.
It really is. And this idea, loss aversion, it pops up everywhere and has really powerful effects on what we decide.
So how does that play out? Like the endowment effect? Is that related?
Directly related. The endowment effect is that feeling where once we own something, we value it much more highly than we would if we were just thinking about buying it.
Ah, okay. Like Professor Rosett in his wine cellar.
Perfect example. He had all this wine he'd bought ages ago for like pennies. Now it was worth a lot.
Right.
But he wouldn't sell those bottles for their current high market price, even though he also admitted he wouldn't buy them at that price today either.
Because selling felt like losing something.
Exactly. Once it was his wine, in his cellar, selling it felt like a loss. And that loss would hurt roughly twice as much as the pleasure he might get from the cash.
So think about your own stuff.
Yeah.
Those things you hang on to. Maybe not because they're worth loads, but just because letting go feels kind of painful.
That's the endowment effect right there. Those boxes of old CDs or clothes you never wear.
Guilty as charged. So, okay, knowing about loss aversion, how can that actually help you?
Well, think about negotiating. If you frame your offer in terms of what the other person stands to gain,
Rather than what they might lose by not accepting?
exactly, that can be way more persuasive.
Mm.
Or if you're trying to make a change, like, I don't know, switching phone plans or something. Focus on the benefits of the new plan, the gains, rather than dwelling on losing the familiar old one. It can make overcoming that inertia easier.
That makes sense. Frame it as a game. What about that experiment with the risk of death? That sounded pretty stark.
Oh, that one's really telling, yeah. They asked people basically two versions of a question about a tiny, tiny risk of death.
Okay.
One group, how much would you pay to reduce this tiny risk by a certain amount? The other group, how much would we have to pay you to accept an increase of that same tiny risk?
And the answers were different.
Massively different. The amount people demanded to accept the increased risk was way, way higher than what they were willing to pay to reduce it.
Because accepting more risk feels like inviting a potential loss, and that looms larger.
Precisely. It really shows that asymmetry in how we weigh potential losses versus potential gains.
Okay, so we're not rational econs, we hate losses.
Hmm.
What else? You mentioned mental accounting.
Right. Mental accounting, this is another big one. It's basically how we mentally organize and categorize our money and resources.
Even though money is money, right? Like
Yeah.
a dollar is a dollar.
That's the econ view. That's fungibility. The idea that all money is interchangeable. Doesn't matter where it came from, doesn't matter what you plan to use it for. It's all the same stuff.
But that's not how our brains seem to work.
Not really, no. We create these mental boxes. You might have your holiday fund box, and you're happy to splash out from that.
But you guard your emergency fund box like a hawk.
Exactly. Even if, shifting money between them would be totally logical from a purely financial standpoint. Or think about the house money effect.
Like when you win a bit at poker or something.
Yeah. Suddenly, you might feel way more comfortable making riskier bets with those winnings because it doesn't feel like your hard-earned money yet. It's like playing with the house's money.
It's in a different mental account.
It is. And Thaler connects this to something called transaction utility. This really gets at why we love a bargain.
Okay, transaction utility. How does he define that?
His definition is something like, it is defined as the difference between the price actually paid for the object and the price one would normally expect to pay, the reference price.
Ah, so it's not just about how much we value the thing itself.
No, it's also about the perceived quality of the deal. Did I get a bargain or did I get ripped off? That feeling matters a lot.
That explains that little thrill you get funding something heavily discounted. even if you weren't planning to buy it.
Absolutely. Retailers are masters of manipulating transaction utility. Think clearance sales, BOGO offers, limited time discounts.
Even stores like, say, Walmart or Costco, with their everyday low prices strategy.
That plays into it too, yeah.
Yeah.
It creates this ongoing perception that you're always getting a decent deal, which boosts your transaction utility on every purchase.
And rebates, too, even if you get the money back later.
Yep. That separate check coming back feels like an extra win, hitting a different mental account than the initial outlay.
This also sheds light on sunk costs again, doesn't it? Like Vince and his tennis club membership.
Exactly. Remember, he kept playing even though his elbow hurt because he'd paid for the expensive membership.
You didn't want to waste the money.
Right. In his head, that money was firmly in the tennis experience mental account. Not using it felt like losing the value in that specific account.
So it's hard to ignore sunk costs because we've already mentally filed that money away.
It really is. So a good strategy to try and overcome that is to consciously reframe. Ask yourself, okay, forget what I already spent. Knowing what I know now, would I still choose to do this?
Detached from the past investment. Easier said than done sometimes.
Oh, definitely. Thaler also had that neat wine survey showing how mental accounting messes with valuation.
How so?
People put very different values on the same bottle of wine depending on how they got it, bought it cheap years ago, received it as a gift, inherited it.
Even though the real economic choice, drink it or sell it at current market value, was the same.
Precisely. Their mental accounting created different right prices and feelings about consuming it.
Wild. And the gasoline example, too.
Yeah, if gas prices suddenly drop and you find you have extra money in your gas budget mental account,
You might just end up driving more or buying premium gas.
instead of thinking, great, I saved $50 this month, I'll put that towards my credit card debt. The windfall stays trapped in the gas account.
So for personal finance, the big lesson is just being aware of these mental accounts you've set up.
Awareness is key. Are you doing things like carrying high-interest debt while keeping a decent chunk of money in a super low-interest savings account?
Because one is the debt account, and the other's the safe savings account.
Exactly. Recognizing those silos and trying to view your money more like an econ would, as one big fungible pool, can really help you make smarter decisions about budgeting, saving, and debt management.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's shift gears slightly. What about self-control? That feels like a big part of being human.
Oh, absolutely. It's a constant battle, isn't it? Thaler talks about the conflict between our two selves, the planner and the doer.
The planner is the part that wants to save for retirement, eat salad, go to the gym.
Right, the long-term focused responsible self. But then there's the doer.
The one who sees the cake, wants the cake now, and worries about the consequences later.
Exactly. The doer lives in the present and wants immediate gratification. And this internal conflict is always there.
That reminds me of the marshmallow test with kids.
Classic example, the kids who could resist eating one marshmallow right away to get two later, that's the planner winning out over the doer, demonstrating self-control.
And Thaler sums it up pretty neatly, doesn't he?
He does, he says. Self-control is essentially about conflict. It's that internal tug of war.
So if it's a conflict, how does the planner win more often?
Well, sometimes the planner needs help. That's where commitment devices come in. These are strategies the planner sets up in advance to constrain the doer later on.
Like what?
Think about those programmable safes. You put your credit card in, set it to only open next week to stop yourself impulse buying.
Huh. Okay, maybe a bit extreme for some, but I see the principle.
Or more commonly, things like automating your savings, setting up an automatic transfer to your retirement account right after payday.
Before the doer self even sees the money and gets ideas.
Exactly. You're committing your future self to save. Setting website blockers during work hours is another simple commitment device.
And even mental accounting, which we just talked about, can be used for self-control, right?
For sure. Using physical envelopes for cash budgeting, this envelope is for groceries, this for entertainment.
When the envelope's empty, it's empty. Harder to cheat.
Or having savings accounts named for specific goals, like down payment fund or new car fund. It makes it psychologically harder to raid those accounts for something else.
Right, giving the planner some guardrails. Okay, makes sense. What about fairness? Does that fit into this behavioral picture?
Massively. Traditional economics often assumes we're just out to maximize our own slice of the pie. Pure self-interest.
But that doesn't always feel right, does it? People get really upset about things they perceive as unfair.
Exactly. We have a strong sense of fairness, and often we're actually willing to sacrifice some economic gain ourselves or punish others if we think something's unjust.
Like the classic example, jacking up the price of snow shovels right after a huge blizzard.
Perfect illustration. From a pure supply and demand view, maybe it makes sense. But people hate it. It feels like exploitation, totally unfair.
And companies that do it often face a huge backlash, right? Bad publicity.
Definitely. Or think about auctioning off that one super popular toy, like the Cabbage Patch dolls back in the day, right before Christmas.
Highest bidder gets it. Pure market logic.
Maybe. But again, it feels wrong to many people. It feels like taking advantage of desperate parents. Unfair.
It's interesting how framing matters here, too. Like, a credit card surcharge feels way worse.
Then a cash discount, even if the end price difference is identical. Surcharge feels like a penalty, a loss. Discount feels like a gain.
And Thaler connects this sense of fairness back to the endowment effect.
Yeah, he suggests that one principle that emerged from our research is that perceptions of fairness are related to the endowment effect. Basically, we feel entitled to the terms of trade we're used to.
So if a company changes the deal for the worse, it feels like they're taking something away from us, imposing a loss.
Exactly. Like when First Chicago Bank tried to introduce a fee for using a human teller.
Ooh, I bet that went down well.
Not at all. Huge backlash. Even though it only affected a small number of transactions, people felt entitled to that previously free service. Charging for it felt deeply unfair.
There are modern examples too, right? Like the Whitney Houston iTunes pricing.
Oh yeah, that was bad. Prices for her music shot up on iTunes almost immediately after she died.
Wow. Talk about perceived price gouging.
Exactly. It felt incredibly unfair and opportunistic, and even something like Uber's surge pricing during emergencies.
Logically, it's meant to get more drivers on the road when demand is high.
Right, that's the economic argument. But when it happens during a blizzard or a crisis, it often sparks real anger because it feels unfair to charge desperate people hugely inflated prices.
I remember reading about an Uber driver who actually wanted to offer free rides during a wildfire because it just felt wrong to profit from that situation.
That really shows that human instinct for fairness sometimes overriding the pure profit motive.
And some businesses build fairness into their model, don't they? Like that restaurant. Next.
Yeah, the owner decided against auctioning off reservations, even though they probably could have made more money short term.
Why?
They wanted to prioritize the customer experience, make people feel they got value, build loyalty. They understood that perceived fairness matters in the long run.
What about those economic games, like the ultimatum game? Do they show this fairness thing too?
Absolutely. In the ultimatum game, one person gets, say, $10 and has to propose a split with another person. The second person can accept or reject the offer.
If they reject.
Nobody gets anything. Now, a purely rational econ, if offered even $1 out of the $10, should accept it, right? $1 is better than nothing.
But people don't always do that.
Often they don't. If the offer feels unfairly low, like $1 out of $10, people will often reject it out of spite, basically. They punish the unfairness even at a cost to themselves.
Wow. And the dictator game.
That's where the first person just decides how much to give and the second person has no say. Even there, people often give something, even though they could keep it all. It shows some level of altruism or concern for fairness.
So it challenges that purely self-interested model. What about the public goods game?
Similar idea. People are given some money and can contribute anonymously to a group pot, which then gets multiplied and shared equally.
The rational thing is to contribute nothing and just benefit from what others put in, right? Free ride.
That's the purely selfish strategy. But in reality, people often do contribute, especially initially. They show a willingness to cooperate for the common good, at least for a while.
Thaler uses that analogy of the roadside farm stand, right?
Yeah.
With the honesty box.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. It works because most people are reasonably honest, but the farmer knows some people might cheat. There's this balance of trust and acknowledging the potential for, well, misbehaving.
So the actionable insight here is pretty broad. Just consider fairness.
Yeah, in your own dealings, personal or professional, think about how your actions are likely to be perceived by others. Is it fair?
Because sometimes prioritizing that sense of fairness, even if it costs a little in the short term, can actually be the smarter long-term strategy. It builds trust.
Exactly. It avoids resentment and backlash.
Okay. Now, what about learning? Don't people just learn from their mistakes and become more rational over time? That's a common pushback, isn't it?
It is. The argument is, sure, maybe students make silly mistakes in lab experiments, but in the real world with real stakes, people learn.
And Thaler says,
He says, well, yes and no. He introduces this idea called the Binmore continuum, named after Ken Binmore.
Okay, what's the continuum?
It's about how likely we are to learn effectively. Learning works best for decisions that are frequent, have clear feedback, and where the stakes aren't overwhelmingly high.
Like choosing what route to take to work. You do it every day, you see if there's traffic, you adjust.
Exactly. Or maybe learning to play chess or poker better through repeated practice. Low stakes, lots of repetition, immediate feedback.
But what about the big life decisions?
That's the other end of the continuum. Things like choosing a career, buying a house, picking a spouse, saving for retirement.
You don't get many practice runs on those.
Precisely. They're infrequent, the feedback is often delayed and ambiguous, and the stakes are incredibly high. It's much, much harder to learn optimal strategies for those kinds of decisions through experience alone.
So just because you're an expert at your job doesn't mean you won't make classic behavioral mistakes when planning your retirement.
That's the idea. Expertise in one domain doesn't automatically transfer to these big, infrequent decisions where our biases can still easily trip us up.
Which really underlines why understanding these biases is so important for everyone, right?
Definitely. And it also shows why Thaler emphasized grounding theory in observation, like his interviews with actual lower middle class families, trying to understand how they really manage their money.
Not just relying on abstract models.
Right. You need to see the misbehaving in its natural habitat.
Okay, so if we know people often don't make the best choices for themselves, especially on big things, can we help them without forcing them?
Now we're getting into nudging. This is a really practical application of behavioral economics. The idea is often called libertarian paternalism.
Sounds like a contradiction. Libertarian paternalism.
It does a bit.
Yeah.
But the idea is libertarian because you're not forcing anyone, you're preserving freedom of choice. Paternalism because you're trying to steer them gently towards choices that are likely better for them according to their own goals.
Okay, so you're nudging them in a good direction, but they can always ignore the nudge.
Exactly. And a classic, super successful example is automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans.
How does that work?
Instead of making people actively sign up, opt-in, new employees are automatically enrolled, maybe at a 3% contribution rate, but they can choose to opt out if they want.
And that makes a big difference.
Huge difference. Participation rates skyrocket under automatic enrollment compared to opt-in systems. It uses our natural inertia for good.
Because doing nothing means you end up saving.
Right. Another great one is the Save More Tomorrow plan, which Thaler developed with Shlomo Benartzi.
How does that nudge work?
People agree in advance to increase their savings contribution rate automatically whenever they get a future pay raise.
So it doesn't feel like a loss in their current take-home pay.
Exactly. It overcomes present bias and loss aversion. You commit your future, richer self to save more. It's been incredibly effective.
What about that Danish study on automatic savings? Did that show anything interesting?
Yeah, it was really revealing. They found that most of the savings generated by automatic enrollment were genuinely new savings.
People weren't just shifting money from other accounts.
Largely, no. And maybe even more strikingly, the automatic feature itself had a much bigger impact on savings than the generous tax breaks offered for those accounts.
Wow, so the nudge, the ease, was more powerful than the financial incentive.
It really highlights the power of defaults and making the desired choice the easy one. It's about the choice architecture, how the decision is presented.
Prompted choice, framing. It all matters.
Hugely. The UK's Behavioural Insights team, often called the Nudge Unit, has done amazing work applying these ideas.
Like with tax collection.
Yeah, they experimented with different messages in tax reminder letters, simply adding a sentence like, most people in your area have already paid their tax, significantly increased payment rates.
Using social norms as a nudge. Clever.
Very effective. But it's also important to remember not all nudges work or work as expected.
Like the attic insulation experiment.
Right. They found that just offering a discount on insulation didn't really move the needle much. People didn't take it up.
Why not? Too much hassle.
That seemed to be part of it. There was later evidence suggesting that offering help with cleaning out the attic first might have been a more effective nudge because that was the real barrier for many people.
So you have to understand the underlying friction or bias you're trying to overcome.
Exactly. It often comes down to that simple mantra, make it easy, reduce the friction for the desired behavior.
Like that text message program for parents.
Yeah.
Read you why 4K.
Yeah, that's a lovely example. Simple texts with easy, actionable tips for parents to support their kids' learning. Gentle, helpful nudges.
But there are ethical questions around nudging too, aren't there?
Absolutely. It's crucial. Thaler and others stress the importance of transparency and ensuring nudges are designed to help people achieve their own stated goals.
Nudge for good, as they say. Avoid manipulation or nudging people towards things that benefit the nudger, but not the person being nudged.
That's the line. There's definitely potential for misuse, so the ethical considerations are paramount.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's try and wrap up with some key takeaways from this deep dive into behavioral economics and misbehaving.
Sounds good. I think takeaway number one is just fundamental. We are humans, not econs.
Right. Our decisions aren't always perfectly rational. They're shaped by biases, emotions, mental shortcuts, all that messy human stuff.
Then there's loss aversion. That powerful idea that losses sting about twice as much as gains feel good. It affects everything from selling stocks to returning clothes.
And mental accounting. How we put money into different mental boxes, which explains why we might treat a bonus differently from our salary, even though it's all just money.
Don't forget the battle with self-control. That constant fight between the planner wanting long-term goals and the doer wanting instant gratification.
And understanding the conflict helps us use things like commitment devices or even mental accounting itself to help the planner win more often.
Then there's fairness. People care deeply about it, often even more than pure economic gain. Perceived unfairness can trigger strong negative reactions.
We also touched on learning how it's easier for frequent low-stakes decisions than for those big, infrequent life choices where biases can really bite.
And finally, the hopeful part. We can use these insights. Behavioral economics gives us tools, like nudges, to help design systems and choices that make it easier for people to achieve better outcomes.
Nudging for good, making it easy, using defaults wisely.
All based on understanding how humans actually behave.
Okay, so here's a final thought for everyone listening to maybe chew on. Think about one specific area in your own life. Maybe a recent decision, maybe a recurring habit, where you've noticed yourself acting in a way that seems, well, a bit irrational in hindsight.
Could be anything: finances, health, procrastination.
Yeah. And ask yourself, how might some of the things we talked about today, maybe loss aversion or a particular mental account or a fairness concern or even just plain old inertia, have played a role in that misbehaving?
And then the forward-looking bit. Now that you're a little more aware of your own very human tendencies, is there one small thing you could do differently next time?
Maybe reframe the choice. Set up a
Yeah.
simple commitment device. Just consciously recognize the bias when it pops up.
Exactly. This deep dive is really just scratching the surface, but starting to understand why we misbehave is the first step towards making slightly better decisions, and maybe just understanding ourselves and each other a little bit more clearly.